1910. Got myself a job at a men's clothing shop. Hart, Schaffner, and Marks. Sit at the machine, shaking in your boots, scared of being fired. For talking, sneezing, looking at the foreman, cross-eyed.
Busy season, get up before dawn, come home in the dark. The children's faces you don't look on, except when they're sleeping.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. As much as some wish to deny it, America is a nation built by immigrants. And stories of immigration and perseverance, like the one told by today's guest, form the grand narrative of the United States.
We're delighted to talk with Francis Jetter, a prolific illustrator and printmaker whose latest book, Amalgam, An Immigrant, His Labor Union, and His American Family in Brooklyn, is published by Fantagraphics. Francis, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you.
You spent 12 years working on Amalgam. What inspired you to devote that time and creative energy to telling your family's story?
It started off with view pieces, and I was not even sure that it was going to be a book at that point. You know, I'd done handmade books. They were oversized, that were in special collections at different libraries, usually university libraries, and I have one in the Library of Congress. That's also in South Africa and in other places. So that's what I thought it might end up being. And then it just kept expanding. It started off mostly about my family as workers in a clothing factory and focused around my grandfather. And then it got to other family members and other labor situations and the past of in labor history. And then at that point, it was an unfortunate future, but it kept going and getting larger. And I heard more stories from family members, and that also added to the book.
It's a really amazing approach to writing a family story. Often people will write stories and, self-publish or whatever and give me their life and as they recall it, generation to generation. And it's honestly not that compelling because it's hard to see anything, hard to really feel what people are feeling, especially if they're unknown sort of quantities in the popular culture or whatever it might be. But the fact that you did it in such a visual way, I think, helps to not only condense the story, but also compellingly show the emotions and everything else that goes into the scenes and the different periods that you depict.
Well, that was pretty important to me, to get the feeling of people living through difficult times and good times also. The history part of it was also of major importance. I did a lot of political illustration for 25 years or so for the New York Times and the Washington Post and Time Magazine and The Nation and The Progressive. So that was something that interested me a lot. I didn't want it to be just a family story. It had to be about those times and how the times affected the people who lived through them. I'd heard stories from my mother about working in a blood bank before the war. The Second World War had started in America. And then also we had letters from my uncle, her brother, who was in Burma at the time. And just the idea of how dangerous it was and saying goodbye to so many young boys who wouldn't come back. That was really something that I thought about a lot. And she remembered being in a car with a boyfriend at the time when Pearl Harbor was announced. And then with many other things, it was before that, living through the Great Depression. and how it impacted the family, people down the block, and also what was happening as far as labor and the garment industry in particular. Um, so that all fed into it and was interesting to me.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Could you tell us about your artistic influences? I noticed you credit muckraker photographer Louis Hine, whose photographs helped bring about child labor laws in the U.S.
One of the images of the child working in, taking goods home for homework in around 1911 is pretty much, taken from his photograph. And I looked at a lot of the photograph in many different areas where children were harmed and adults. Everybody, had things like losing arms because of bad machinery and no regulations. So he was really uh, so great as far as his photos and what he did to expose what was going on. Um, I guess my influences as a child were from a book that my cousin, who was a painter and then an architect, gave me. I was about 10 years old, and way in the back there was a Katha Kolwitz piece and a George Gross piece. So they didn't give them room in the center of the book, but for me, those were the most interesting things in there. So it was that. These days, I continue to look at Helen Levitt's photography, and it's always so fresh. No matter, sometimes you look at something and you get bored with it. No matter how great it is, you've seen it a lot and it just doesn't have the same impact. But Helen Levitt's work just does that for me, and I get the excitement by looking at it. The sense of the human quality in the work and her great sense of humor at the same time. Um, is something that is uh, it's so great and so inspirational. And I also look at Alice Neal a lot. And there's a great exhibit of her work, just so many years of wonderful feeling for people and truthful, I think. You look at them and it's about them. It isn't just about the way she wanted to paint.
The book's title seems to refer equally to the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, which your grandfather belonged to, your grandfather's own personality as a dedicated union man and a tyrant at home, the U.S. as a mixture of people, and the mixed media techniques you bring to the book. How did you go about bringing the book together?
As I mentioned, it didn't start off being this long book that would go on forever. Um, and it got put together in some way, and then it kept getting revised and added to. Um, I wanted it to be about America and how America treated its immigrants, and it goes way back to where um, there were rules against Chinese immigrants because um, some people figured that their jobs were taken by these immigrants. And that was back around 1880 something. I don't know the exact date. And then when my grandparents became citizens in 1917, there were laws that excluded, I think, mostly Asians and I don't remember and Near Easterners too, I think. And then after that, in 1924, they were having literacy tests for Jews and Italians. So it's gone on a really long time. Um, so that was part of uh, my feeling for, making it very much about immigration. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers, which uh, was founded in 1914 after terrible conditions in the factories and in sweatshops and with child labor. Um, and they ended up fighting and getting a 50-hour work week when it had been between 70 to 80 hours a week. And people would be fired if they wouldn't come in all those days. There was TV that was rampant in the factories and very bad conditions. So that was a victory then. Um, So it was Amalgamated Clothing Workers. My grandfather's personality, because he was a little rough on his children, um, and tough and didn't allow toys and hid them away. Um, so it was the Union, the country, as a combination of all sorts of people from many different places. Uh, Also the family, which was a combination, a blend of the individual and the group. So that seemed to be the case for everything in this book. That was a combination or blend, sometimes of disparate um, sources, different combinations that didn't easily blend.
It's really interesting that the book is designed and bound as an album also, like a family picture album, or at least that's the way it looks to me. And, that's really what a photo album is. It's an amalgam of all these different sort of flashes of memory and moments in time and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yes. You mentioned about also the different look of the book, from photos and some things that were collaged and some things that were mostly linoleum cut prints and some etchings as well. Um, it didn't really occur to me that these were different things because they just kind of came from the same place, and it didn't, I've heard that said and it's true, but it never occurred to me.
Amalgam is filled with powerful images. A few that stand out to me are your depictions of collective bargaining as the musculature of an arm made of several different arms, your grandmother, who you call the caretaker of both stomach and soul, shown with the body of a challah and roses, and your illustration of the union's garment-making process. Are any of the images especially meaningful to you?
I don't know, at the time of making them, each one was really important to me. And now I have some that mean more to me, sometimes because of the individual or sometimes because of what it ends up saying. The one with my grandmother was kind of obvious since we all lived in the same house, with open doors, and she baked and she was great cook, and that was part of it. Her Holly did not look like that though. And I had to go to Zabar's. I don't know if you've heard of Zabar's. Zabar's is on the next block. And, at that point, I just picked out the one that I thought was beautiful and that also looked like mini breasts, so so that worked out for that. Now they don't have anything that looks as nice as the one I found there some years back.
You include a wonderful illustration of the first Mad magazine you purchased. How did Mad influence your sensibilities growing up?
A lot. And I had older cousins, the ones I grew up with were also in my grandfather's little house in a place called Lake Mohegan. And so they had a lot of comic books, and in particular Mad, and that was the one I really fell for. It was so irreverent, so hilarious. The drawings are wonderful. I still think it's about the most terrific magazine I've ever seen. Um, their ads, I love their ads, and one of the ones my cousin had was one about reburial, and it was because Stalin thought he had his perfect burial spot, and then he was removed, so they were having this ad for burial insurance so he wouldn't be moved.
Your images of the multifamily home was very evocative and really, sort of spoke to me. I'm wondering what that was like growing up in, with, bacon in your aunt's house and then, your grandmother. Okay, no, very kosher and well as well. What was that like?
I guess I thought it was mostly great when I was a kid. We didn't have any privacy at all, and I don't know how that was always great for the grown-ups. But my older cousins were like 2 brothers and a sister to me. Uh, so and they were they had interesting tastes, and as far as our family went, they tried different they were not conventional, which was a good thing. They were interested in art and in art house movies and, different things. brought in that we could be part of. I'd heard stories from all of them growing up, and that was really something that was important to me. Now, it was a completely secular house except for my grandmother. Um, we didn't have anything. There was kind of a joke that when they were voting on Passover, whether they would go through anything, that that everybody decided, no, let's eat. You know, that was it. Um, and my grandmother kept kosher, and my mother kept kosher because she kept thinking that my grandmother might come up and eat, which didn't happen. But um, so my aunt had bacon and shrimp and all of that, and so that's how we got to have our experience with it.
I think there's something really wonderful, especially with different age kids from different, parents living together in that way. I'm sure you benefited just in your maturation and your exposure to the world in a way that many families don't have access to if we're just sort of, the nuclear family living in a home.
Maybe with those cousins, it was definitely the case. Um, just because they were artistic, they were interested in music um, and really expanded things. For me, I was taken to Greenwich Village with my cousin, um, and went to her favorite places, and also got taken to the movies with her for movies that weren't mainstream. Um, so that was great. What wasn't so great was a lack of privacy. Um, the entire family worked making clothing, and my father would come home with shears when he'd lose his job, um, because when it was Christmas time, people were laid off, and it had to be terrible drudging up those steps with everybody watching. Uh, there wasn't such a thing as anything really being private there. So, but there were many good aspects to it.
Getting laid off during the holidays, too, that must have been rough for the family.
It was rough for him. Um, wasn't what who wants to really work in a factory? It's better than no job, uh, but he wanted to do everything so perfectly as well as he could with cutting clothes. That was supposed to be an elite job, uh, cutters in a clothing factory, but um, I don't think it was that elite, uh, and it was kind of, I don't know, was humiliating because it wasn't anything he did, but it was a very sad, hard time for him, and it would happen a number of times.
Your grandfather escaped the Russian Empire to find poverty in New York City, where he fought for a living wage and struggled to make a better life for himself and his family. This is an almost universal aspect of the American immigration story, and one that we're reminded of daily with the current government's attack on hardworking immigrants. This seems like an important moment for your book to come out. Would you agree?
Yes, I guess I'd agree that several things that I guess the going towards unions being more accepted as they had been defeated was also something. And now I don't know because things are so difficult in this country, um, that it's a good time for anything except that maybe the rebellion is coming sooner because of things being so terrible. I don't know, when it's gotten to be so awful for immigrants and for workers and just generally terrible. So, um, I think it's a good time for a book that where the subject is are those things.
One of the things your book reminded me of is that old expression, as much as things change, they stay the same, in terms of the way that we treat immigrants, the crackdown on unions, the exploitation of workers, all of that sort of thing. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that gets so bad that maybe then things change for the better. I don't know. When my grandfather left Poland and it had been taken over by Russia, uh, it was years before, it was pretty bad for Jews and for other people who weren't assimilated. Um, Poland wasn't part of the Russian Pale, actually, where Jews were sent uh, from Moscow. But it was the same story of people thinking their jobs were taken by other people that I think that the Russian Pale came about, where they were sent out to other places. So it goes so far back, just as far as the research I did. One thing I didn't mention was that uh, a way that the book kept expanding was I had a fellowship at the New York Public Library for a year and did a lot of research there, which was great. I never intended to have maps until I saw the map department there and saw the breakdown of the takeover of Poland in 3 places and how it ended up mostly being Russia. But so that became part of it, as well as some parts about labor history, and reading about them just it was so fascinating, uh, to me, and really part of the story and the background of it. And finding out that Taft-Hartley, which was very bad for unions, um, that act that finished a lot of things off, that was partially, McCarthy in the background, Nixon and McCarthy also. Um, and I keep thinking about McCarthyism with what's been going on also.
Amalgam is an amazing labor of love, and Fantagraphics did a wonderful job packaging it in an oversized format. Do you have other projects in the works?
Right now, I've been working on something, and it's really all over the place. Amalgam was kind of all over the place, but this has to be more focused. And so, I'm making some pieces and then seeing where they end up, if they get left in or out, and then what goes from there. I recently did a poster for the School of Visual Arts, and they do subway posters. So it was in a lot of subway stations, and it's always art is something. And so the topic was art illuminates in dark times. And so I did a poster with Orwell and his prediction of people burning his own book and doing protest posters in between, and working on this new project. And it was great that Fantagraphics went with the large format I'd wanted, and just produced it in that way. There's a fold out in the back of um, the labor, what had gone on in factories with my grandfather, who's older and who poured acid on cloth, by the way, um, to stop what all the practices that were going on with sweatshops and working 7 days a week. And so he told me about that when I went back to visit so many years later, and he was very proud of it because things weren't fair, and he was going to do whatever he could to make them fair. So he's older and looking in on these scenes, and it folds out, and that they wanted to have this fold out was really, I thought, just great that they were doing it and printing it this way. So, it's been really good experience.
Well, thank you so much, Frances, for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.